Okay, good evening, everyone. It's Richard here again from the Success Book Club, and I'm back with another very interesting interview. And this evening, we're going to be talking about Matthew Syed's book, Rebel Ideas. And with me here this evening, I have Barry Phillips. He is the chairman of Legal Island, which is a very impressive compliance company here in Northern Ireland that operates all over the island and over in GB as well. And he is very well known for his work in diversity and inclusion here in Northern Ireland. And he's also run the Diversity Gala here, which is a very impressive event which runs annually outside of what's going on at the minute. And all sorts of people from all different communities all come together for a big, huge gala in Belfast. Really impressive stuff. And Barry also last year received a BEM on the Queen's Honours List for his services to employment and equality. So Barry, it is absolutely fantastic to have you with us. And I know you're highly interested in this book. So it'll be great to hear your insights. Good evening.
Good evening, Richard, and thank you very much for that kind introduction, and hello to everybody. Yeah, this book I have read a number of times and I've really enjoyed it. So I did spend some time trying to persuade you, Richard, to give me a slot on your excellent show, just to pass on my views in terms of why I think this book is probably one of the most important books on diversity and inclusion that has been written in the last 5 years. It really is very good, and it's a very important book. Can I tell you a little bit about the author?
Absolutely.
Richard? Matthew Syed is a British journalist. He's an author, a broadcaster, and he's also a table tennis player. He competed as an English table tennis international and was the English #1 for many years. He was 3 times the men's singles champion at the Commonwealth Table Tennis Championships, and also competed for Great Britain in 2 Olympic Games. He has also embarked on a journalism career. He's worked for The Times since 1999, but he's perhaps best known for a number of best-selling books, starting with Bounce in 2010, then Black Box Thinking in 2015, You Are Awesome in 2018, and more recently, Rebel Ideas, The Power of Diverse Thinking in 2019. Richard, somebody asked me a couple of weeks ago, Barry, you keep going on about this book, but what is new in this book? And I thought it was a great question because it got me thinking and reflecting for a while. And I asked myself that same question quite a few times. And I actually came to the conclusion that I don't know that there is much that is new in this book. There's nothing that is groundbreaking in the sense that it's revealing, you know, new legislation, or rather new research that has just come from a university that is just going to completely readjust our thinking in this space. But why this book, I think, is such an important contribution to the D&I world is that it's the most accessible and reader-friendly book on diversity and inclusion that I think there is. And Matthew Syed has a fabulous ability to make a point and illustrate it with a really good story. And there are stories throughout this book that make it very readable, but also difficult to put down, because he also has this clever technique of telling you a bit about the story, then getting back to a main point. Then he'll pick up the story a bit later on. So he shares the story gradually with you, which makes it such a compelling read.
So could I, that's really interesting, Barry. Could I, and we'll get on to those stories in a little minute, because when I read the book as well, that for sure is the thing that really jumped out to me.
Yeah.
But could you maybe, first of all, sum up, like, what is the overall kind of message of the book?
I guess the overall message of the book is that we have to think very carefully about diversity and achieving more diversity, and in particular cognitive diversity, so just thinking in different ways. Then he'll sort of say, once we've achieved that, we also have to be thinking about inclusivity and how to tap in to that more diverse resource and bring these two powerful things together and get them working powerfully together. And you've got something that can be very, very effective.
Definitely. And for me, that's the one thing. And, that's the two words that really struck me that are on the back is cognitive diversity. I'd never actually heard of that before. So, I obviously knew of diversity, racial diversity, and also in terms of gender, backgrounds, all that sort of thing, particularly growing up here in Northern Ireland, obviously. But I'd never heard of this thing, cognitive diversity. So maybe could you give us maybe one or more of the anecdotes that sort of outline what cognitive diversity actually is?
Well, in terms of the anecdotes, I think the thing that comes to mind most of all was what he says about homogenous groups. And he says, if you have a homogenous group, in other words, a group that looks pretty much the same, he says it's still possible to get them thinking and stretching their thinking by doing various exercises with them. And he gave one that I think was tried out at a university in America, in which he split a group into two halves. And he basically said, look, when it comes, the group that were asked just to go away and do something performed in a relatively moderate and plain sort of way. But the other group that were asked to do a few exercises and saying, imagine yourself living abroad, imagining yourself in a completely different environment, imagining yourself in a completely new context and working environment. Right, now come back to this problem. Those that in their minds have been asked to go somewhere else were actually better at performing that task than the other half of the group that had just been asked to get on with the task. So it's quite interesting that if you don't have much demographic diversity, you can still achieve quite a lot of improvements in diversity by focusing on cognitive diversity and doing exercises with that group that will encourage greater stretch of thinking and to really get the brain cells turning over more quickly and in different directions. So that's really the thing that came out of the book for me in terms of cognitive diversity. And I'm sure there are many other examples, but at the moment, that was the one that really jumped out at me.
Could you tell us, there's a really interesting, or what I found really interesting anyway, story quite early in the book about the CIA.
Yeah.
Could you tell us about that? It's a fantastic example of cognitive diversity, or the need for it, let's say.
Yeah. He talks about the failure of the CIA to understand the threat of bin Laden. And he basically makes the point that because they missed the threat that was behind this man or came with this man, that 9/11 happened and all sorts of chaos afterwards. And he basically makes the case and says, look, at the time of bin Laden, the CIA was a very homogenous group. It was a very clever group of people. But he was saying that they were almost entirely white. They were almost entirely middle class, entirely from the Ivy League universities in the United States. But because they were very homogenous and because they didn't have very much diversity going on, there was nobody in that group that could read the signs and the dangerous signals that were clearly coming from bin Laden, that to many Muslims, they would have been picking up on what bin Laden was trying to convey in his messages. But to this mainly white homogenous group, these messages were being completely missed. Now, in the defense of the CIA, you could say, well, it's very easy, isn't it, to be wise after the event. The CIA probably had to read every day hundreds of messages and signals that were coming from all over the place. So at some points, I was actually thinking, is he being a little bit hard on the CIA here? And is this a little bit unfair? But once I was through those kind of moments, I was thinking, actually, this is a really great point in terms of illustrating just how badly things can go wrong if you don't have a diverse team. And he makes a very good point here. He says you can have a bunch of people and they can be very, very clever. But if they're all fairly similar, they'll end up mirroring each other, and they will be simply reflecting back each other's views, and they tend to work off or operate having quite a few blind spots. And when that happens, it can be really dangerous. And a good example that he gives in the book is the poll tax in the 1980s. Now, for anybody in the group that perhaps isn't from the UK or is not young enough to have been in the 1980s, the poll tax or the community charge was a charge that the Thatcher government tried to introduce as a way of gathering local taxes from people. But it proved to be deeply unpopular because it impacted, as a lot of people saw, in a very unfair way. And there was a review committee that was set up to review what was seeming to be going wrong with the implementation of the poll tax. And it was headed by a very, very intelligent bunch of people, but people that came from a very wealthy background and people that were pretty out of touch with the average man or woman in the street and were having real difficulties understanding the impact and why this poll tax was so unpopular. And he mentions something about this group and says that they actually had a jolly nice time together. They would meet and smoke cigars and play bridge and would just basically laugh at how difficult some people are finding this poll tax, but feeling themselves that it was a logical and necessary thing to do, and that all the people outside would at some point come to understand it. But of course that never happened. The poll tax was a complete disaster. Very few people paid it. Did you pay it, Richard? I certainly didn't.
I'm not old enough, Barry.
You're not old enough. Okay, that's a good answer. I am, and I didn't, but let's not chat about that too much. And it was a spectacular failure. And again, that was a good example of how a lack of diversity caused a big problem.
Yeah, and would it be right in saying, you know, there's many applications for that? Well, one that springs to my mind is sport, where, you know, in some sports, sometimes it's very beneficial to bring in somebody from effectively the outside world or even a different sport who can have just a completely different angle on something, because sport can get very entrenched in its own thinking. For example, you know, rugby coaches can get quite entrenched in that way of thinking, and sometimes to bring in whether it's a very successful business person or somebody from another elite environment can really help things along. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. And there is an example in there where the FA from the English Football Club brought in a number of people from different disciplines. So outside of football, to basically review why it was that England has such strong local clubs, but hasn't been able to do anything really of any significance at an international level for the last 50 years. And he gives in that book an example of how these people came to get together to bring in the expertise from other sports and to bring in the outsider view to help really mix things up, because the feeling was at the time that's what needed to happen. Things needed to be mixed up. They needed to be disrupted. And I think in business, it's often the same thing. That an industry is usually disrupted by somebody that hasn't grown up in that industry, but has come in from somewhere else with fresh eyes and said, well, look, you've always been doing it like this. Doesn't actually make sense anymore. Let's do it like this. So the big disruptors in the world generally tend to be those that just come in from the side rather than have grown up in the industry and suddenly see something. So it tends to be the person that benefits from a different viewpoint.
Yeah. So for you, obviously being very heavily involved in D&I here in Ireland and, keeping in touch with that internationally, what would be your main kind of takeaway from the book that you see yourself putting out to people and putting into action?
Yeah, that's a great question. I really enjoyed what you had to say about homophily. And homophily, for anyone who's not familiar with the term, and maybe I'm not pronouncing it correctly, it's the faintly depressing tendency of human beings to go and seek out people who are like themselves. And it's kind of like our natural algorithm. Yeah. And we do it because we want to feel normal. We do it because we want to surround ourselves by people who are like us, and then we do feel mainstream and normal. But it has consequences that because we do that almost automatically, then we are inevitably surrounded by people who are like us, and we get this mirroring problem going on. We don't get challenged anything like as much as we should be challenged. And that affects the equality of our decisions. And he says in the book, he says this, he says, if I ask 10 people 10 questions, or 10 for 10 solutions to an issue, how many solutions am I likely to get? And of course, what he's trying to get at there is that if you've got people who are largely the same, you're likely to just get 10 solutions back. Whereas if you've got lots of people who are quite different within that 10, then you're going to get lots more than 10, and you're going to benefit from the richness of ideas and views and opinions that are going to come back to you. And it got me thinking about how you break your own algorithms. And it made me think about stepping out of my usual circles. It made me think whether, once a week, once a month, I need to do something deliberately, because I think, okay, that will take me into a circle of people that I don't normally circulate in, which will be good for me. But it also made me think about how difficult it is to do that nowadays, because if you use Facebook, then Facebook tends to use algorithms that are basically forcing you to find, or helping you to find, people who are like you, same sorts of interests and so on. And this algorithm thing, which is actually very interesting, I read somewhere that 60% of the people in America that belong to hate groups actually found each other courtesy of an algorithm used by Facebook or one of the other social media platforms.
Yeah.
So it's quite alarming when you think about the human algorithm and homophily, but also the digital algorithms that we are unaware of, have no idea of forcing us in various directions, and are generally forcing us in front of people that tend to be like we are.
Yeah.
You know?
And I think doesn't it sort of depend, on the sort of, excuse me, person you are. Like for me, I love nothing more than that, to go into a group that and find out different cultures, different opinions, different backgrounds. But I can totally understand how that's not for everybody. It's not, it's out of people's comfort zones a lot of the time to do that sort of thing. And, what would you say is a solution to that? Is there a solution to the echo chambers that he talks about in the book? Does he mention anything around that? Like, what can we do about that?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I have asked myself that quite a bit. And there is this phrase around that I've heard quite a bit about being comfortable with feeling uncomfortable.
Yeah.
I think that is something that we need to accept more in our lives, of stepping out of our comfort zones and just trying new stuff.
Yeah.
And I know you journal quite a bit, Richard, and so do I. And one of the journal questions that I have that I ask myself every day is, what have you tried in the last 24 hours that is new?
Good one. Really good.
No, I'm quite angry with myself sometimes, because sometimes when I'm journaling in the morning, I just have to put a cross in that box, because there's nothing that I've done that is new in the last 24 hours. And sometimes when I can write something in there, I actually feel really quite good about that and think, okay, well done, and it may be something small. It might be a new recipe, or it's a new neighbor that I've managed to speak to. Just a small item, something that is new and fresh. And I just think we have to just ask ourselves more regularly, what is new for us? What have we tried that is fresh, is different, and maybe challenging to us? So I think it's little micro steps like that in that area, which are probably the solution to this.
So yeah, that's great. I love that technique. I must adopt that myself. That's cool. And I want to ask you. So you're obviously a big fan of the book, a big fan of Matthew himself. However, is there anything that you disagreed with in the book?
There were a few things I kind of questioned. I questioned the CIA thing, and I thought, okay, is this just being a bit hard on them? And I did ask myself, okay, if the CIA had been asked for a response, what would it have read like? If they had published that response to what he had to say? And my guess would be that they would say something like, sheer volume is what got us here.
Yeah.
Rather than the failure that they Syed points out to. So I struggled with that. He has a great story about the disaster on Mount Everest in, I think it's 1997, which led to 8 people dying. And he uses this as a great example of deference to authority. And this brings him into this area of the dissent channel, which is really interesting. He talks about, I think it was a State Department in the United States. They would have meetings and they would have a designated dissenter at each meeting. So they would agree something and then look to the dissenter and say, okay, now pull this apart. Now tell us why this is a bad idea.
Yeah.
And so he has a lot to say in that space. He gives a great example of a plane crash in which the co-pilot was too scared to say to the captain, look, we're running out of fuel. So there was one academic that he quoted and said, this is remarkable that a co-pilot would rather crash the plane and die rather than correct the captain. So he has a lot to say in that space. But much of that I was agreeing with, and I was thinking, okay, this is very interesting. And I remember reading the book and then flying back from London, and the co-pilot came on and said, hello, my name's James, whatever, and I'm flying the plane today. And I immediately felt safer because I thought, okay, the captain would criticize the co-pilot.
Yeah.
Co-pilot wouldn't most likely criticize the captain.
Yeah.
There's less of a chance of that happening. So that was another interesting.
I can really identify with that, having, as you know, sailed on boats and ships and stuff. And I suppose would you identify with this as a leader in a business yourself? Isn't a lot of that about the leader creating the environment that is, that the people feel safe to challenge their kind of views and things? Because I've witnessed that too. I've sailed with people. I've sailed as chief officer and had a second officer, who sometimes would challenge me, which is great. I welcome that. But at other times, a lot to do with his culture and upbringing and things, wasn't comfortable with that.
I mean, it's interesting. Your world and my world as a business leader, and some similarities and differences. And I guess maybe somebody wouldn't want to challenge you because they might think, well, bloody hell, I'm stuck with this person on this 3-week journey. So if I fall out with this person, I've got 3 weeks of putting up with his bullying if he's going to be like that. If I've challenged him and he's been really annoyed. I've got a similar sort of safety issue, safety to speak in this company. Because at the end of the day, my company is very small compared with many other SMEs or certainly medium-sized enterprises. We're 20 in my company.
Yeah.
So if somebody were to fall out with me, then potentially I have the ability to make their life a misery. And it's very easy for any leader of an SME to think, okay, I need to be approachable and I mustn't lose my temper. And I need to be open and say, look, my door's open at any point if you want to come in and give me feedback. And don't worry, you can criticize me, I welcome it. But they know that they have a mortgage or they have family that they have to feed. And I'm the guy that's paying their salary.
Yeah.
So I have to be realistic about just how likely it is that they are going to come in and sit down opposite me and say, look, Barry, you really screwed up yesterday, didn't you?
Yeah. And I seem to remember you did a TEDx talk on that theme. Am I right in saying that?
Thank you for that nudge. I did a TEDx talk, and it was about open door policies. And what I was trying to persuade people to do was abandon open door policies, saying that they're very damaging, insofar as they basically allow a business leader to give absolutely zero consideration to how communication ought to be done in a company.
Yeah.
And they represent a get out of jail card for the business leader who can say, well, my door is always open. They've always come in and told me this, but they're just leaving in a hole.
Yeah.
you know.
Understand. So yeah, people can check that out as well if they're interested. So one thing I'm really interested in is really how this book could impact daily life. And obviously the world event that really springs to mind at the minute is what has happened in the United States with Donald Trump, and obviously this extreme kind of views and, you know, different camps, completely different end of the spectrum. So how do you see the book in relation to that? Like, how does that intertwine?
Yeah, that's a great point. And I think there's two things that immediately I point to in the book in that area. One is that he says people are caught in echo chambers, and we tend to find people who are like ourselves. And again, this is back to the homophilia and also to the algorithms. And we end up getting into communities in the internet that mirror very much what it is that we're already thinking. And in a way, you can almost sense that he's lamenting this development in society as a result of the internet. When you think, when the internet was first popularized, you know, in the late 90s, so to speak, it gave you the potential of reaching out to contact and befriend all sorts of people from all over the world. And whilst a few people perhaps have used it effectively like that, most people seem to be using it to find people that are fairly similar to themselves. So that's one thing that you kind of think, if only we used it in a different way to break out of these echo chambers. The other thing that point he makes is that you would think with access to all this information, we would be able to fact check and be of a disposition that we would fact check much more frequently than we do. You know, in the 80s, now I know you weren't there, Richard, but in the 80s, pre the internet, if you heard something on TV, it was very difficult to fact check something because you just didn't have access to, you know, the information that we have access to now. And I remember in the 70s when I was, you know, first set homework at school, if your parents didn't know who the hell Thomas Edison was, your only chance was to go down the road and knock the door of the really posh house in the development, and every development seemed to have one really posh house.
Right.
You had
Botanica.
Yeah, and you know, I'd go down and say, Mrs. Kent, would you mind if I use your encyclopedia again, please? I've got some homework. She'd, oh, come in, lad, and you'd look it up, and Thomas, and you'd write a paragraph or two, and you went. Now you've got access to a seemingly infinite amount of information. So you would think that people would be listening to the likes of Trump and thinking, well, he's just claimed this. Let me just Google to check this. But it's not happening. It's just not happening. So there's a lot, I think, in his book that points out perhaps why Trump managed to get away with what he did, and why people, by getting into these huddles of like-minded people, were able to disconnect from the truth, hide from the truth, and just think their own thing. And I guess in these kind of thought bubbles, they would start one thing, and then that view would be reflected back, but, you know, with even more gravitas, and then it would be, you know, developed further. And instead of something being challenged and exposed as the nonsense that it was, people just bought into it more and more, and it just snowballed and just became a really huge thing.
Yeah, yeah. So it's very, very topical from that point of view. Obviously, last year, and things. And for you yourself, or, you know, perhaps slightly bigger organizations than yours, what do you see the impact? What impact could this have on their kind of daily culture and things in an organization?
Yeah, well, I think for me, I've seen the impact of this book because I've just spoken to a lot of people, not so much in the D&I space, but business leaders and those in HR. And they tended to raise the book before I mentioned it. They'll be sort of saying, Barry, what are you reading at the moment? Because I'm currently reading this book by Matthew Syed, and off it would go. So the sheer presence of this book and prevalence of it, I think by itself is telling me that it will have an impact. But also, it's having an impact in important places. I was listening to the radio recently, and the Chief Constable of Northern Ireland was asked for his favourite book, and he said, well, I've just read Rebel Ideas, The Power of Diverse Thinking.
Wow.
He said, this is a really important book for me. So it really is landing, I think, in some very important places. And I think this comes back to the fact that it is just such a good read.
Yeah.
And he's such a good teller of yarns, of stories.
Yeah.
If I didn't know otherwise, I would say this guy is Irish, if I didn't know, because he's just got the ability to tell a really good yarn.
Yeah. Yeah. And isn't that, we could have a real theoretical book, out of a very academic, university or whatever. However, if we are going to change culture, society, it needs to be related to story, doesn't it? Because story is really what will have an impact on the average person, let's say.
Yeah, I agree with you. And as a communication method, I don't know if there is a better way of communicating than through story. You'll know, Richard, that in both Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland, there are people who are professional storytellers, make a living out of telling stories. And I don't know how many other countries can boast that as well. And that is the case because I think people realize just how powerful they are. Yeah. And, when you go to a presentation class, the first thing they'll say is to make a presentation really, really good, it has to have a really good story. Yeah. Preferably, you have to open up with a really good story.
Yeah.
And close with a good story. And don't they all say that, somebody could make a very good presentation, but if you ask them for the content of what they said, like 3 hours later, the chances are they'll remember only the stories that were shared in their presentation. You'll know that as having done a TEDx talk yourself, Richard.
Yeah.
How important it is to have a good story.
I think.
Remind me.
What's that, sorry?
Do you have a good story in your TEDx presentation? Just remind me. There's
a couple of good stories in it. What I find really interesting, and actually you've just provoked a thought, I would love to ask Mr. Syed where he gained his talent for telling a story.
Interesting, okay.
And where he was able to craft that. It's obviously something that he recognized was a great medium for hitting home certain points, such as in the book. So yeah, we got to ask him that at some stage.
Yeah, that is a great point. He does it very well. It'd be very interesting to know whether, he's been coached in terms of the structure of writing the book, or whether that's just something that naturally comes to him. Yeah. I have this horrible feeling he's just one of these naturally brilliant writers that pops off chapter after chapter in no time at all. The rest of us slog it out just to get a page that we're happy with after 2 days working on it.
And he does, anytime I see him, because for anybody watching, you may recognize the name. He's regularly on Sky, for example, on Sky News. And anytime I see him on Sky News, you know, sharing his views, he is very eloquent. You know, he's very. You can see why he's invited on to news shows to put his point across, because he makes it really well. You know, and I think for me, I found it kind of it took me aback to realize that he was actually a sports star in the early days, because you know he seems to have a natural gift for journalism and communicating. Definitely, I think.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So, is there anything else, Barry, that you'd like to share, talk about, or anything that you're up to yourself that people can check out?
I'm just firing through my notes here. I think really I'd like to go back to the designated dissenter point, because I think that is very, very valuable. And I have mentioned that to a few CEO friends of mine. They've all said that's interesting, and they'd like to perhaps experiment with that, because they think it could be quite powerful. I suppose the other thing I would say is this, that because of COVID, we have opportunities now to do things in a very different way. And one of the points that he makes in the book, and I'm not sure if I made a note of this, was simply he said that in the way that meetings are conducted in business, most meetings, they tend to be taken over by dominant characters in the meeting.
Yeah.
And I forget the stats, but he says if you have like 60 minutes of a meeting, then if there's 4 in a meeting, then the chances are there'll be one that will talk for like 45 minutes. And the other 3 will just account for the rest. Yeah. And he says that is like, you know, a wrecking ball to D&I, just going through the whole process. And you might have quite a bit of diversity around that table, but if you have a dominant character, it's just going to completely wreck your chances of getting the benefits from that. So I think what I would say now is that with Zoom and having digital meetings, we now have an opportunity to hit the reset button here and say, let's do meetings in a completely different way. Let the person conducting the meeting use this as an opportunity to hear from the introverts around the digital table, from those that are perhaps young and are concerned about the seniority of others in the meeting, those that are inexperienced, those that are fresh into the company, those that normally don't get too much airtime in a meeting. Because if we can hear from those people, then you know there's a chance that we can benefit from a much richer discussion, and in some cases, you know, better arguments or more arguments in a meeting, which will produce a much better outcome at the end of it.
Yeah, brilliant. That actually takes me back to doing team building on boats, and we used to, you know, bring businesses on board boats and do racing days and that sort of thing. And it was very, very often recognized by the facilitators and also the leaders within the company that whenever you put people in that kind of different environment, the very unexpected personalities came out. So for example, you could find that the person who manned the reception desk, who was usually quite quiet in work and didn't really speak unless required, whenever they were put in this environment on a boat, they automatically became a leader, you know. And it was really interesting to see those kind of insights. And I think that type of team building is, you know, exactly what you're just saying. It's very beneficial to kind of realize who the people sort of really are. So it's very interesting you say that about Zoom, how that can happen. What would you say would be, what's a good technique, do you think, to alleviate that, say in an in-person kind of meeting? Is there a structure kind of in place where you can include everybody, have inclusion if it's in a physical boardroom, say?
Yeah, well, I mean, the first thing that you can do is you can control the dominant character a lot more easily, because you're in charge of the mute button. Now, you can be quite rude about this, but you can, say to the dominant character, okay, this is 5 minutes each to everybody here, and who would like their first 5 minutes. Dominant character will say, I'll go first, and when he gets to 5 minutes, you say, thank you very much, mute, on to the next person.
Yeah.
Now, it might just be that he has a lot more, or she has a lot more experience, and therefore may feel that they should have more airtime. But of course, you have more control in terms of who you ask to go first. And the chances are that if you ask the dominant person to go last, there's a very good chance that the people who will go first will actually give you their view rather than reflect the dominant person's view if they've already heard that.
Yeah,
so
sure.
Even something like the order that you go in can make a big difference.
Yeah. And do you see that playing out whenever we do get back to a physical meeting, that those same things that we're learning from Zoom meetings can then be instilled? Do you feel in a similar, obviously no mute button, but in a similar style?
Possibly. But there's an interesting question there in terms of whether what is going to become the standard way of doing a meeting, because even once we're through this COVID period, clearly there's going to be a lot of hybrid workers. So there will be a lot of people that will continue to work as they are now working, either all of the week or some of the week.
Yeah.
So it might just be that you'll have people who are in the office, but when it comes to meeting times, they just get in front of a screen and do things digitally. And that will actually be the normal way of doing things. Yeah. Who knows? And it may just be that, some companies will say, okay, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, it's up to you, but Monday and Tuesday you have to be in, because those are going to be meeting days. Yeah. And if that is the case, and we're all meeting around a physical table just like before, let's hope that meeting leaders have learned from this COVID experience and have learned the importance of controlling a meeting so you get better contributions from everybody around the table. Very good. Love it. Very interesting, Barry. And so tell me, if, let's say somebody's watched this and they're particularly maybe in Ireland or close to where you are, where can they check out more about D&I? Where can they find that out? Well, good question. We have a diversity and inclusion discussion forum which takes place once a month, the last Friday of every month at 3:30, and we all meet online to discuss a diversity and inclusion issue. So if they wanted to join that, they don't have to be from the island of Ireland. You can be from anywhere to join that. And of course, we would love to have you. And you could just drop me an email, simply Barry@legal, then dash like a minus sign, then island, as in treasureisland.com. And we can send you details. It's free to join that. Other things locally, watch out for our gala. Watch out, we have a Diversity and Inclusion Summit, which is coming up on the 25th of March, where we've got lots of speakers online talking about that. And for more information, just Google Legal Island and you can get to the relevant page and find out more information. Brilliant. Thank you so much, Barry. That was great. And yeah, obviously, if anybody's interested, the book is widely available on Amazon or wherever you buy your books. And highly recommend it. Really, really good read. So, Barry, thank you very much. You're welcome, Richard. I googled before we recorded this, and it's £7.50 on Amazon at the moment. It's a great read, packed full of very useful conversation points and so on. So, well worth. Yeah, and
what I'll do is I'll put your email wherever you're watching this. You'll see links around to the book and to Barry's sites and email address as well. So yeah, thank you very much, Barry.
Thank you very much for the opportunity. Really enjoyed it.
We'll chat soon. Cheers. Bye.
Bye-bye.